Okay, welcome everybody. I'm so fantastic you're all here at lunchtime to join in this unique event, and I've been asked to kick off, and so I'm just waiting for my slides to arrive. Yes, I am Colin King, a schizophrenic, a trainer. The first slide, we can just play. It's just an introduction to what we're trying to address today.
A particular dominance culturally or in terms of numbers of a particular ethnicity, in particular white ethnicity, that's a serious problem. And I think that one of the answers is in terms of medical education, in terms of both the diversity of intake to medical schools and also of the breadth of education which is provided to young people who fundamentally want to do good in the world.
Yeah. So this is motivated by a project we had a couple of years ago. My two sons, I'm really concerned, will they experience the world in which I experience of institutional structural racism, misdiagnosis? Can we go to the next slide, please? And I talk about this thing called Drapetomania, which was a mental disorder invented by a person by the name of Cartwright. And I think it's re-emerged in the way we work across the color line. Because what I think is happening, or has happened historically over this period of time, is the deafness of a whiteness that does not hear the Black voice. And in this cultural translation, our voice gets denied, it gets translated as a mythology, and it gets colonized. The picture for me is actually epitomizing something that's going on now. We're begging, we're asking, we're pleading. We want to be heard. Our voices need to be institutionally faceted in all the work we actually do to enable us to have a shared model of learning. So what does that look like in the next slide? So historically, we must contextualize what has happened ontologically in terms of what experiences is recognized as important, but what knowledge leads to a particular type of bias. And what slavery has done is taken away our shared reality and silenced certain communities through a medicalization. I'm going to go into that big detail later on, but what's emerged in our cognitive software is this notion of a scientific racism that we believe is actual factual and true and complicit. And it's really challenged because people like Goffman and Little and Lipswell are beginning to positioning why we have alienated the Black voice. For me personally, my story of being locked in a cell, beaten up, forced to eat my own shit, in the transition to being a mental health practitioner, I've seen the other side, this omnipotence of whiteness within the mental health system, this management of a pathology of models that misrepresent my existence and existence of communities that are now being 4 times more likely to be detained in the mental health system. This is a major issue. And I'm just going to go into a bit more detail in the next slide. In the next slide, I'm beginning to address here. I'm not going to play the video, but if anybody had a chance to download the Black Doll, White Doll, it's this preference towards the superiority of whiteness, which Fanon captures so imaginatively and creatively in one of the best psychological books, which should be the foundation of any training for psychiatrists and psychologists, is the Black Skin, White Mask. That's the center of our training. It's actually beginning to unmask and empower a new perspective that leads to a shared reality that actually enables us to break down what Niall said about this institutional racism that's emerged in mental health system. That leads to what I called not improving the experiences, but what Garvey says, emancipation, and to dismantle a care system that's based upon a new type of slavery, a new type of cost-effective way of dealing with race. Hence, today, why I think it's so crucial that we work across borders rather than stay within borders. So what's the challenge that we need to do in the next slide? So what does a shared model look like? I was unfortunately given an MBE, and I've now been shamefully say that you should not have taken it, because what the MBE represents is the way through colonial processes, our realities taken away, and when we've been given and rewarded with a disorder that does not exist within the Afrocentric experiences of mental health within our cultural context. And I've done a lot of research, and there's some great researchers on the line, but the picture on the right is where I was locked up in Maudsley Hospital, but also where I took people who I did not consider to have a mental disorder into this new location of a modern form of Drapetomania. So my challenge is this: how do we look at the new methodological ways of challenging institutional racism in our mental health system at this current time? And I think there's some proposals I want to address in the next section. So I'm hearing this: if we are to look at challenges of values, we have a personal challenge on the left-hand side to look from the historical through to the personal, to the professional, to the practice. Because in that, we have a responsibility in moving from the transition from individual to shared learning, to depoliticize, to repoliticize our values, to make conscious values that have become racialized and explicit. More importantly, I'm now saying we have a duty of a racialized care to change and challenge models of theories. Because in the third section here, if it does not lead to an outcome in terms of Black lives in the mental health system, recognizing that there are alternative ways of understanding values, there's a way of us declaring our lived experience. Lived experience is not restricted to people who are survivors. We all have lived experience. All of you here today have a lived world which is relevant to your personal values. And lastly, we need to look at the unconscious, how we are oppositional to each other rather than working in a more consistent, compliant way. And there's a need to say, how does we address this in their mental health practice? So here are some suggestions I'm making forward today. If we go to the next slide. So we need to begin to connect the ontological, that's the way we experience the world, to the epistemological, new types of knowledges to understand what now has taken a new form of training from the Euro-centric to the Afrocentric, and recognize the potential and possibility of Fanon enabling us to look beneath our mask to conceal the restrictions, the symbols that are consistent in mental health practice that are revealing a dominant form of whiteness. And then we need to look at micro knowledges around how we use language and challenge language, and how we look at other alternative interconnected challenges such as class, religion. Because in that, we can all be Afrocentric and Eurocentric. These models can merge together and they can be applied flexibly to engaging in a new approach that's Euro and African led as well, but they're interconnected. Because the biggest challenge in mental health system is that how do we challenge a diagnostic framework which has actually led to the violation and the demonization of particular cultures that lead to the mission and restraint, care plans that are no longer relevant, discharging people to institutional racial sentence that's going to actually lead to their return. And lastly, which we're working on with the Lancet Psychiatry, the new slavery community treatment orders. So I want to then contextualize this to something that's quite important in my life and something we're going to face in the future in the next slides. George Floyd is a really painful moment in all our social history. And the Mental Health Act Review paper is the most disrespectful memorial to the life of a person that was killed in the streets of New York, and the memory of so many Black men who have been killed in the mental health system. So I'm thinking that this act needs to look at the lived experience, not the diagnosis. The data should enable us to lead to real, concrete, emotional, cultural changes and address cultural bias. Cultural appropriate advocacy must be about the parity of lived models. And that links into what we just discussed before. My model, my ontological experiences should be just as relevant as a consultant, a psychologist, anybody in that medical profession. Because if it's not, and you keep asking that we need a changed workforce, we're moving towards cosmetics rather than content. And it does not reflect diversity, or it's not moving to what I call a redistribution of power. That's really the foundation of real choice for people working across the color line. And in there, if we're going to look at improvement, we need to look at equality of power with mental health professionals, not beyond the care plan, beyond the diagnosis, but real changes in the diagnostic framework. So how is that going to be addressed? Just the next question, challenge, please.
Together thing, we're trying to sort the problem together rather than I'm just doing what you tell me to do. It's deep because what we're asking white people to do is to empathize with our situation, which is a lot. Like, there's a lot for a young black person in London just to move. Like the same thing that my mum was saying about my brother. He's got OCD, so he's thinking like people are trying to kill him. He's carrying stuff, and that's on the street. So for a normal black young guy, yeah, it's hard. But if we put into a community where I can go to my barbershop, I can chat to him. He's got training, he knows what to do. Or the yard shop or something, where I feel more comfortable to chat rather than just a one-on-one with someone that don't look like me, don't chat like me, don't do anything the same.
I apologize for the sound voice, but I think this is really crucial to contextualize the theory of change, the motivation of change to the reality for young black men who are more likely, like my son in this picture, who's gone for a difficult time. He's had suicidal thoughts. My second son has got compulsive disorder. What we're going to do to change his life. How is this mental health white paper going to address this? Because if we're looking at stronger detention, we need to look at the risk of death to black men. We need to look at the relevance of sentence law and the huge number of black men that have been inappropriately restricted, restrained, medically, physically, and killed. We need to look at this notion of advanced documents that depoliticize the system through the document. If we're going to have nominated persons, we need to nominate alternative theories and the models of liberation, which those people can actually carry in the shared model of learning in their challenges with working in the mental health system. But most importantly, if we're going to look at the notion of capacity, we're going to look at the capacity of this system, this mental health system, to really deliver a shared approach, a shared reality that really addresses the experiences of black men, black communities, but also white others in that shared reality. I'm just going to address how that can be done in the last slide. Let's go to the last slide. The next slide. Just hold it. You just hold it a minute. Don't play it yet. For me, this is what traditionally happens in the shared reality. Black is the person as the lived experience with a mental disorder. White is objectified as the person who's objective, who is the consultant. Just listen to these two voices, and I just want to move on to what I see as the challenge. So the first voice is mine. You can just play that, please.
They look at me, they don't see Colin, they don't see me as an individual and an identity with a specific history. They see a catalogue of black men who come off this stereotype of being big and dangerous and angry, and that's equated to people who then are outside their cultural understanding. And the Mental Health Act reproduces that legally in terms of how it looks at black people. It reproduces that culturally in terms of the stereotypes it makes about black people's lives, their families, their patterns, their cultures.
Okay. I'm just going to link it to the second voice.
With Colin and this group is that, of course, that very reliability, right at the very heart of what we regard as best science, immediately excludes minority voices. And if the system is predominantly white, that means it immediately excludes black voices. Yeah. So the very reliability, it's not so much that, so if white supremacy actually is embodied in the very theoretical basis on which we're trying to change things. Now, I hasten to add the reason why I hang in with with this group and working with Colin despite my ignorance and continuing difficulty of understanding what it's all about is because I think what Colin's brought to this whole discussion is something really quite novel. It is about inside outside, and it's captured for me in the phrase getting beyond the colour bar. And of course it doesn't mean literally the colour bar. What it means is getting beyond a black-white standoff, Jewish, Aryan standoff, whatever those tribal
Okay, can you tell me how long I've got left?
Yeah, you've got about
Okay,
2 minutes.
how long?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, fantastic. I wanted to bring this to the fore because I think it kind of encapsulates and makes the reality of working across the colour line. And what needs to happen is that Bill is eloquently actually spelling out the challenges and changes for us. And these are the 4 points that I think are crucial for equality of power, equality of voice, and for Bill to disclose more of his lived reality of what I call whiteness as a protective characteristic, because it's objectified as superior and it's never disclosed. But blackness is subjective and it's always disclosed. It's the basis in which we create our pathology. And so the strength of the black experiences, the historical experiences, has in the first point, a shared ontological experience. What is the experience of actually working together, training together, changing the system that informs shared decision-making? Secondly, what is the shared epistemological learning? How does my knowledge base, my historical knowledge base as a black man in a rich history in African literature and models and theories equate, integrate and coexist and co-learn and co-produce a new approach to mental health? But more importantly, in the mental health system, going back to Niall, how do we look at what Goffman talks about, the backstage reality of the learning, the hidden views and opinions that we don't exclude or talk about that informs decision making? And lastly, before I finished, how do we arrive at a shared model for equality in mental health work? The mental health white paper, and we just produced a paper, cynically is a paper for whiteness. It's not a paper for the black community. And in that, while we may reduce the number of people inside the system stays in check, and it has the dangerous potential to recreate the experiences that have emerged from the period of Drapetomania. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. I think Anna Bergqvist is going to seamlessly join us at this stage.
Okay, thank you so much, Colin, for kicking off with not only rigor, but with an engaged starting point. What I want to do today is to pick up some threads where Colin left off, precisely in recognising the implicit values that sometimes subtly shape how we orient ourselves towards one another. So I'm picking up specifically on the operations of implicit conceptual schemes. And this work really came out from a piece of work that me and Colin and Bill Fulford did together last year in thinking about the psychiatrist's vulnerability to abuse, that is specifically so as long as these implicit values are not articulated. So the background here is very much one of trying to meet across perspectives, but where part of the challenge is precisely one of recognizing your own values from your initial conversational starting point. And that's also why we titled this paper The Hall of Mirrors. So the very process of trying to work across the colour line with a view of dialogue as opposed to opposition is precisely one of mirroring yourself through the reactions of the other. So we try to use this idea of the hall of mirrors with a view of both articulating the different voices that there are, but doing so in a way that respects difference. So the way I think about this as a philosopher is very much one of problematizing what we mean by relationality and indeed also relational agency in that encounter. And I take as my starting point here some resources in the philosopher Iris Murdoch. Iris Murdoch wrote in the 1960s and 1970s, and she paid very special attention to the perspectival nature of moral categories. In particular, she criticized the standard representation within received models of theorizing, both within moral philosophy, but also in thinking about the mind more generally in a totally neutral way. Instead, she wanted us to acknowledge precisely the relational social dimension of the way we view the world. So in her essay, The Sovereignty of the Good, Murdoch writes, "The enemy of arts and of morals are the same." And I quote, "Social convention and neurosis. One may fail to see the individual because we are ourselves sunk in a social whole which we allow uncritically to determine our reactions, or because we see each other exclusively as so determined. Or alternatively, we may fail to see the individual because we are completely enclosed in a fantasy world of our own into which we try to draw things from the outside, not grasping their reality and independence, making them into dream objects of our own." End quote here. So I don't want to dwell too much about the notions of fantasy and so forth. What I do want to take from this starting point is the recognition of the importance of safeguarding against your own perspective and the subtle ways in which your own framework of reference might shape the way you relate to the other. So in the paper we call this articulating our different perspectives, thus understood as a social whole of an engaged life world with which we engage with one another. And as a key idea for taking forward with this work is the methodological idea of overcoming othering, precisely overcoming othering as a way of integrating lived experience in shared decision and in research design. Next slide, please. So then, I guess, how do we overcome what we may think of as values auto-blindness in the way that Iris Murdoch warns against? This is precisely where the idea of the relational nature of evaluative perception in mental health comes into play. And the key idea here is that we can come to see our own values through open-ended dialogue with someone else whose life world gives them a different perspective to that of their own. So metaphorically, and I return to this image of the hall of mirrors here, we see our own values in the mirror provided by the other person's perspective. This is why extending the metaphor of the hall of mirrors provided by an open society of different mental health code perspectives, we can make progress, I think. And specifically, one thing that I have argued in my own work falls out of this way of perspective taking, conceptually speaking, is first of all an epistemic no priority claim about knowledge in intersubjective relating within mental health contexts, such that neither perspective of the parties involved is prioritized over the other. Now, this is clearly relevant to shared decision-making and also co-production as essential elements of best practice in contemporary person-centered care. But it's also, it brings with it, as we will see, this risk of dropping your guard and doing so in an authentic way. And the second claim is really a claim about reflecting about the meaning of individual diagnostic categories as functions of the wider interpersonal systems in which they operate. So it is this second claim that, combined with Iris Murdoch's earlier arguments about what I refer to as social convention and neurosis, that in itself illuminates our concepts of implicit values and indeed its relevance for race equality and working across the colour line. Because on this view, communicating across differences in the entrenched social life worlds is itself something that can serve as a crucial corrective to being overly committed to the prevailing mainstream dominant voice or prevailing norms and ways of seeing the world. More generally, we can also think about the use of various diagnostic categories and the wider interpersonal systems of meaning in which they operate. Just as there is no such thing as, say, patients in isolation from the wider healthcare system in which they operate, the very notion of being detained and so forth itself requires this wider system of meaning. So I think, and one of our panelists will come back to this when it comes to thinking forward in terms of practice, but just having that critical distance before you categorize one event under one concept rather than the other itself, I think, is usefully thought of as having that reflection about the wider systemic system of meaning in which the relevant term operates. Next slide, please. Okay, and so I've given you a theoretical model. I've also painted a fairly rosy picture of how this is all the solution of working across the colour line. I think I want to say a little bit more about the challenges that that the very concept of relationality brings with it. And that is that this new task of looking at your own values as a way of avoiding othering in the domain both of psychiatry and mental health more generally is itself a matter of recognizing perhaps the resistance that you myself might have. Indeed, there is a real sense in which the task of trying to see things right across different systems of meaning is itself a moral challenge in attaining this knowledge. And you may ask, well, what difficult in what sense? Well, first of all, perspective taking is a process that requires you to want to engage in a relational process to see things aright. And thinking forward, I think I want the next slide here. Thinking forward, that is also one of both of looking at yourself in the mirror and indeed recognizing various power structures and indeed wider implications that are always operative in any types of systems thinking. So the last thing that I want to comment on is that this process of dialogue and conversation, perspective taking, as I have called it, is one that operates with the implicit premise that can remain different and yet making progress across different systems of meaning. So difference here, and again, I use the work of Iris Murdoch here, is not just a difference in the application of shared concepts. It's also a difference in the repertoire of frameworks of meanings that different people understand and employ. So one thing that element of recognizing meaning brings with it is thereby a mechanism for dialogue in addressing both the challenges of diversity and values pluralism, such that no perspective has to give in. In other words, within this, this framework that we elsewhere call an open society of stakeholders, there is no single voice at play. And indeed, the aim is not one of having to reach a consensus. The moral challenge, perfect. The moral challenge is itself one of recognizing the variety of voices that there are, like a hall of mirrors, in making contact. And this, I think, is also one that echoes various extant models of values-based practice, where recognizing values, you know, bringing them up to the surface is also about partnership, but also partnership with the difference, where part of the shared decision-making is itself a matter of recognizing different needs, different expectations, and different hopes of those involved in mental health care. And I think that's a really important aspect of bringing with us this sense that dialogue across the colour line need not be phrased in terms of polarization. It can be one of mutual exploration and curiosity, where we can nonetheless retain difference, but doing so as a way of recognizing a plurality of voices as itself an aspect of shared decision making. If I can have the last slide, please. So I will leave you with this last slide. These are ways that we can further reflect upon this theoretically. The emphasis, first of all, is on the reality of the experience of mental health and of illness for the historically situated experiencing subject, but where that subject is always already part of a wider social framework. So there is a relationality built into the very concept of lived experience itself. Secondly, the challenge also of co-production is itself one of recognizing that the partner that you're working with have value as a knower. So with that, I think we can really make progress with the significant challenges that Colin has set the agenda for us for today.